It's time for a story. Are you ready? Here we go. There was a boy named Leaf who loved nature. Whenever he was free, he would walk around in the forest and look for interesting things. Sometimes he would bring things home to try to learn more about them. He had lots of field guides and he would look things up, and he was sure to make friends with any adults he met who knew a lot about nature, and he would love to go and ask them questions later on. Leaf had a favorite place. Directly behind his house, there was a huge old oak tree, and he liked to go behind that oak tree and sit where nobody could see him, but he could see the whole forest. One autumn day, Leaf was sitting beside his tree, and he heard like nails on bark. So very slowly, he turned his head, and he saw a squirrel coming down the trunk. It came closer and closer to him, and then it jumped onto his knee, and it turned and looked at him. Its eyes seemed to be asking for something. Leaf looked at the squirrel very closely. It was a fox squirrel. He could tell because it had a golden belly and a grayish back, but it was small. Could this be a baby? Just yesterday, his neighbor had been explaining how baby squirrels can become dehydrated. Leaf opened up his water bottle and held it out toward the squirrel, and that little squirrel leaned forward and began to lap up the water, and it did that for a while. After that, the squirrel jumped back onto the trunk and ran all the way up, and Leaf watched it go up all the way, part way up the tree, to a leafy nest, a great big ball of leaves, and just disappear in there. Well, every day after that, Leaf would bring water to the base of that tree. He put a bowl there, and he would make sure that the water stayed fresh. And every day he would visit that tree, and he would check, and there would always be some water gone, and he would always look for squirrels, and sometimes he saw them, but he was never sure if it was the same one. When winter came, they put their bird feeder out in the backyard, and the birds would come, and people would try to keep the squirrels away, but it's hard to keep squirrels away from a bird feeder, and Leaf really liked to watch them anyway. He would see the squirrels come to the feeder, and he would always wonder, is that the same squirrel? Did that squirrel live? Well, he watched the squirrels so much that soon he was able to tell them apart, but he never did figure out which squirrel was the one that he had given water to. When spring came, Leaf went even more to his favorite spot because it was so comfortable and lovely then. Sometimes he went in the morning, sometimes he went in the evening, sometimes he went in the middle of the day, and once in a while he would go in the middle of the night. Every so often he would wake up and it would be hard to fall asleep again. And if the night was clear and warm, he'd just take his special blanket that was just for going outside and go sit under his tree. One night he woke up and it was a full moon, so moonlight was just pouring through the window, and it was so bright, and he'd gone to bed kind of early, so he didn't feel very sleepy now. He took his outside blanket with him, and he went to the tree, and he leaned back against the trunk and looked up. It was still early spring, and the leaves weren't fully out yet, so he could see stars. He'd just begun to feel a little bit drifty when he heard like nails on bark. And then he felt little paws on his shoulder and the brush of a fluffy tail against his cheek. And he turned his head really slowly until he felt whiskers. And he held very, very still. Oh, And in that drifty place, he thought, I wish I could talk with you. And then he heard something. Only it wasn't exactly like hearing. It was more like knowing. We can talk, said a small voice. It had the scratchy tone that a squirrel has when it says, "Quack, quack, quack." Could this be happening? Leaf almost forgot to breathe. And then he thought, I wish I could see your home. As soon as he thought it, things began to feel different. Those little squirrel paws on his shoulders, they began to feel less distinct, kind of as though they were pressing through thicker skin. And his own gaze seemed to get closer to the ground. And then the squirrel wasn't touching his shoulders anymore. It was standing right next to him, as big as he was, or as small as he was. Leaf looked at himself and saw that he was covered with fur. And he looked at his hands and saw that now he had only 4 toes per foot and long pointy nails at the end of each finger. Let's go, said the scratchy voice. And the other squirrel went off up the tree. And Leaf followed. His body knew just what to do. He ran up the tree on the tips of his fingers and his toes. The squirrel stopped at a branch. Leaf perched beside her on the branch and turned to look down. Oh, oops, bad idea. He looked back at the squirrel instead. Are you ready to see my home? Leaf and the squirrel continued up the trunk, up and up and up. Partway up the trunk, the squirrel stopped in front of a leafy ball, and then she disappeared. Leaf approached the side of the ball. It wasn't so easy to see a door, but he could feel warmth and moisture coming from one spot and sort of a nutty, squirrely smell. He poked his nose in, then he poked his face in, and then he crawled in. There was just a tiny, dim little bit of moonlight making it through the door. So he couldn't really see very much, but he could tell that there was more than one squirrel in there. There were babies, 3 of them, all bundled up together. Oh, for a while, Leaf lost himself in the feeling of curling up amongst all those furry bodies. And everyone wiggled and wriggled and rearranged themselves until everyone was comfortable, everyone fit together, and everyone was warm. Now Leaf did feel sleepy. At home, he always slept alone in his bed. But here, curled up in a pile of animals, all warm, wasn't hard to fall asleep at all. The next thing that Leaf noticed was sunlight. Lots of sunlight. So much sunlight, it didn't seem like the inside of a squirrel nest anymore. He lifted his head. He looked at his hands, which now were just covered with bare skin and had 5 fingers each. He looked around. He saw his outside blanket. He saw the earth. He saw the trunk of the tree right next to him. And he looked up the trunk, and he saw a squirrel just poking her head out of her leafy nest. And she looked down at him and said, and that's the end of the story.